A teenager mocks Clint Eastwood for his iconic cowboy hat, but what unfolds next is a quiet confrontation that challenges not just egos, but deeper values. It was a lovely day at the outdoor flea market, where rows of colorful stalls stretched across the open lot under the warm sun. Families strolled between booths, browsing vintage treasures and handmade crafts. A tall, older man in a weathered cowboy hat and a worn leather jacket moved quietly through the market. His posture was steady, his movements unhurried as he chatted briefly with a vendor selling fresh herbs. To anyone watching, he seemed like just another shopper enjoying the day. Nearby, a group of teenagers lingered by a food truck, laughing loudly. One of them, a lanky boy with a mischievous grin, noticed the man and nudged his friend. "Check out the cowboy. What's he doing here? Looking for his horse?" The others snickered, their voices carrying easily over the market buzz. The man didn't react at first, examining a jar of honey at a nearby stall, but as the laughter grew louder, he glanced up, his sharp eyes briefly meeting theirs before he nodded to the vendor and moved on. Emboldened by his silence, the teenager raised his voice. "Hey, old man, you lose your cattle?" The man paused, turning his head slightly. For a moment it seemed he might ignore them, but then he faced them fully, his expression calm. "Something I can help you with, son?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. The teenager hesitated, then smirked. "Just wondering if you got lost. This ain't the Wild West." His friends chuckled nervously. The man studied him for a moment before giving a small, almost fatherly smile. "I've been lost before," he said quietly. "It's not so bad, as long as you find your way back." The teenager faltered, unsure how to respond, but his friends egged him on. "Too old to care, huh? Bet you can't even hear us." The man's smile faded. He turned back to them, his tone firm. "I hear just fine, kid. Words have weight. You might want to remember that." The crowd began to take notice, the laughter dying down as a quiet tension settled over the scene. Taking a step closer, the man added, "You've got a choice. Use your words to build something or tear it down. But don't forget, what you build reflects who you are." The teenager flushed, glancing at his now silent friends. The man gave him one last steady look before turning to continue down the row of stalls, his movements unhurried. The teenagers stood frozen, their earlier bravado replaced with quiet uncertainty. As the man reached the next stall, an older woman nearby leaned toward one of the onlookers and whispered, "Isn't that Clint Eastwood?" The whisper carried just far enough for the teenagers to hear. Their eyes widened in unison, and they exchanged panicked glances. One of them muttered, "No way! That was him?" The teenager, still trying to keep up his act despite realizing who the man was, stepped forward with renewed arrogance. "What's the matter, old man? You think that cowboy hat makes you something special? Are you afraid of me?" Clint Eastwood heard the words but didn't flinch. He didn't respond immediately, just kept walking as if he hadn't heard. His calm indifference only seemed to escalate the teenager's frustration. The teenager fumbled with his hands in his pockets, looking for something to get a reaction. After a long pause, the teenager, trying to provoke him further, said, "Do you wear that hat in your bedroom too? Bet you love that ride, huh?" The comment was low, and a few people in the crowd exchanged looks of disapproval. A couple of them shook their heads, clearly unimpressed by the teenager's antics. The teenager noticed, but as soon as he saw his friends laughing and encouraging him, he felt emboldened. However, before the situation could escalate further, a vendor nearby, overhearing the rude remark, stepped forward with a stern look. "Hey, kid," the vendor called out, his voice cutting through the tension. "You don't talk like that, especially not to someone who's earned their place in the world. Show some respect." The teenager smirked, clearly unfazed. "What? You too? What's it to you?" he sneered, stepping closer as if to provoke the vendor further, but the vendor didn't flinch. "It's not about what it means to me," he said firmly. "It's about treating people with dignity, even if you think you're smarter than them." He took a step closer, his tone sharp. Clint Eastwood, who had observed the exchange, stopped mid-stride. Instead of intervening aggressively or escalating the situation, Clint simply gave a soft smile, not in mockery but with quiet understanding. He raised his hand to the vendor, signaling for him to stop, then gestured with a slight nod toward the teenager. The crowd held its breath, sensing something important was about to happen. Clint walked up to the teenager, his gaze steady but not angry. "You know, kid," Clint said in his signature, gravelly voice, "sometimes people think they get points for running their mouths, but it doesn't work like that." The teenager, taken aback by the calm demeanor, started to open his mouth, but Clint raised a hand. "I'm not angry at you," Clint continued, the words soft but meaningful, "but I think it's time you understood a thing or two about respect." The teenager's expression shifted from cocky to uncertain. Clint didn't wait for him to respond. Instead, he turned and nodded toward a nearby food stand. "Come on, let's step aside and talk for a minute. I'd like to have a word with you." The teenager hesitated for a moment, still trying to maintain his cool, but Clint's composed, no-nonsense attitude left him with little room to argue. Finally, he nodded and followed Clint as he made his way toward the stand. His friends, now silent, watched with a mix of curiosity and confusion, sensing this wasn't going to be the confrontation they had expected. As the teenager walked up with him, Clint Eastwood, being a humble and forgiving person, offered to shake his hand, but the teenager had other plans. With a desire to mock further, he extended his hand for the shake but pulled it away as an antic and laughed. But his laugh stopped as soon as he realized no one was cheering for him. Instead, he only got questioning looks from other shoppers. The onlookers whispered to teach this teenager a lesson, and some of them even asked to call the cops so that there should be some legal action on them. However, Clint Eastwood had other plans in mind as he walked towards the audience. He had handled dozens of brats like this in his life, and he knew exactly what he had to do. He asked other shoppers to silence with a simple gesture of his hand, and everyone listened to him as if he were a familiar, respected figure. With calm demeanor and intimidating presence, he walked back to the teenager, who now seemed confused. His friends were looking at him with questioning expressions, wondering, "What have we done?" Their stupidity had led them to a point where there was no going back. Clint Eastwood could clearly see the teenager's hands trembling, as if all his bravado had disappeared. Clint Eastwood put a hand on the teenager's shoulder, who was now sweating, and although he wanted to confront him about what he meant, he realized the teenager was just a kid, operated by his hormones, trying to look funny to others. But there was something more. He realized his behavior of seeking validation meant he was an introvert, someone who just wanted to show people that he was funny somehow. These mixed feelings kept Clint Eastwood thinking for a while, but after a brief moment he began speaking. He started by addressing the teenager. "I was like you back then, when I worked hard to make a living at a market just like this." The onlookers suddenly erupted in delight, knowing that someone who had such an old-school presence had worked hard at places like this in the past. The teenager had a questioning look on his face, and he realized that he had made a mistake as soon as he heard about working at a market. But his desire to keep his tough guy character for the sake of reputation didn't let him go. He kept giving Clint Eastwood looks as if he didn't care and said, "So what? Do you want a prize for that now? Ha ha!" And with these mean words he laughed harder, only to see angry faces in the audience. The teenager didn't realize what mess he was getting into. Clint Eastwood stayed calm. He could have easily destroyed the teenager with his presence, but he focused on the story. "Do you know how hard I worked in this very market in the 80s? I almost got robbed at least twice." This question hit everyone hard in the audience, and some of them erupted with shouts of, "Yeah, we respect that," and others booed the teenager. Now the teenager was struck by his words. "You kiddin'? How could someone survive that and still be here today?" Clint Eastwood laughed at the question, now convinced that this teenager only wanted some attention and nothing else. Clint Eastwood said with a calm voice, "Well, I did. You can do your research on it too, or, as the younger people say, Google it." The teenager was surprised by this revelation. He quickly pulled out his phone and searched if what Clint Eastwood said was true. After a moment of silence, he started sweating as he read a brief paragraph about Clint Eastwood's contributions to the market and his perseverance. He now realized that he made a terrible mistake, and his hands started shaking again, quicker this time. He fumbled with his words, man, and it seemed like he wanted to apologize but couldn't find the words. Clint Eastwood, as iconic as usual, didn't want a sweet apology. He wanted to teach the teenager a lesson. He put a little pressure on his shoulder and said, "I survived, stayed critical for days, but came back. Do you know why?" Giving a reassuring look to the crowd, he continued, "For the sake of this community." His words were simple but measured, and for the crowd it meant he could have walked away but instead respected the values that made him who he was. After facing so much in his life, he came back and kept going. As he looked again into the teenager's eyes, he said, "If I knew I was saving you dumbasses, I would have never come back." Clint Eastwood turned back to the crowd and asked a critical question that seemed to resonate with everyone. Where are values and respect? Have we forgotten how to behave with people who've been here for years? The crowd replied with a big no. Everyone knew the teenager was wrong and began asking Clint Eastwood to throw him out of the market. Clint Eastwood turned back to the teenager as he asked, "Do you find my cowboy hat funny enough now?" He moved the mic away from him to ensure some privacy. Seeing this, the teenager came and apologized for his behavior. "I'm sorry, sir. I let my fears control me." There was some sadness in his eyes, though. He wasn't a bully. He was just a normal person trying to fit in. Clint Eastwood realized it right away. As tears came rushing to his eyes, he said, "See? Offending just to fit in doesn't work in the long run. You've got to be true to yourself and respect others the way you want to be treated." These words hung in the air for a moment. The teenager now analyzed the situation and said, "I cannot take back what I did, but all I can say is sorry. I didn't know who you really were." Clint Eastwood replied with a laugh, "What if I wasn't me? Would you have treated every older person this way?" Now the teenager had an apologetic face as he said, "No, I've truly learned my lesson. This is no way to treat someone. I'll try something better to come out as charming as you are, sir." Clint Eastwood felt happy knowing he had inspired someone to be better. Instead of a dramatic gesture, Clint simply placed a hand on the teenager's shoulder, offering a firm but kind look. "Remember," Clint said with a quiet but powerful tone, "respect isn't something you earn by trying to be tough. It's something you show every day through your actions." The crowd, moved by his words, erupted in applause. A few from the crowd captured pictures of the moment, and the story soon spread, highlighting how Clint Eastwood took a moment to teach a teenager a valuable lesson about respect and humility. The day ended as usual. Clint Eastwood, who didn't want any recognition for his actions, quietly left the flea market. The teenager, humbled by the experience, kept apologizing to the public and promised to be more respectful from now on. If this story resonated with you, there's more to discover. Click on the video on your screen to dive into another heartfelt tale that celebrates life, respect, and the power of meaningful moments. Don't wait. Your next inspiring journey is just one click away.